Hi, this is Sue Jackson of the Book by Book blog, and I'm here today with my March reading wrap-up. Now, March was an amazing reading month for me. I read 9 books in March, which is a lot more than I normally read. However, I did participate in middle grade March. So 5 of those 9 were middle grade books, which of course go a lot quicker than other books. So that's how I managed to fit 9 in. I really enjoyed middle grade March. One of the hosts was Books and Jams, and I'll link to her down below. And there were 5 different categories. Now, you didn't have to read all 5 books, but I did end up reading a book from each of the categories. So I'll mention those as I go through. So since I have 9, I better get going. I don't want this to take too long. The first book I read in March was The Editor by Stephen Rowley. As you can probably tell, this is a library book. This was read for my neighborhood book group. It was our selection for March. And I really enjoyed it. I expected it to be like a super light, mildly entertaining read. But it turns out it is a lot of fun and it's funny, but it also had a lot more emotional depth than I expected, which I really enjoyed. So it's about a young man, well, I think he's about 30, named James Smale. He has just gotten a publishing offer for his first novel. So he's very excited about this, very nervous. His agent sends him to the big publishing house in downtown New York. He's led into a conference room and they tell him his editor's coming in to meet with him. And his editor, it's set in the 1990s. His editor turns out to be Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. And she did indeed work in publishing as an editor in the 90s. So there's a lot of funny moments around, him just being overwhelmed by this super celebrity being his editor, but also him struggling with his book. So his book is fiction, but it's autobiographical, and it's about a mother and a son. So ever since he wrote the first draft and gave it to his mother to read, she's barely speaking to him. She's really upset that he wrote about their family, even though it's fictionalized. So when Jackie comes into the picture, or Mrs. Onassis, as she's known at her publishing firm, she's there not only to edit his book, but to help him find a satisfying conclusion for it. And as a mother herself, she's got some insights. So it's really interesting. It gets into a lot of mother-son relationship stuff and family stuff. And I really enjoyed it. We had a great discussion at book group. Most people enjoyed it. There were a couple of outliers, as is typical in a large group. But for the most part, we enjoyed it and had a great discussion. So that's The Editor by Stephen Rowley. And I've heard great things about Rowley's other novels, like Lily and the Octopus and The Guncle. So I'd like to read more from him for sure. Next up on audio was my first book read for middle grade March. And this was called Room to Dream by Kelly Yang. And this fit the category for middle grade March of featuring an Asian character or set in an Asian country. It actually met the criteria on both counts. So this middle grade book is about a 7th grader named Mia. She's Chinese American. Her family owns and runs a hotel in California. And she's got 2 best friends. One of them lives in the hotel with her family. The other one is a boy Jason, who's really into cooking and wants to be a chef. But Mia's kind of struggling with 7th grade. Everything feels different to her. She does still have her 2 best friends there, but one of them is beginning to take high school classes because she's really advanced, and, there are some rifts forming. So in the midst of all this, Mia's family finally gets to go back and visit China. They moved to the US 5 years earlier. They haven't been back since. And they've finally saved up enough money, gotten the visas and everything to go back and visit. So Mia's really excited to see her family, her aunts and uncles, her grandparents, her cousins. There's one cousin in particular, her age, who she's really close to. And they head back to China. And of course, Mia notices now, as an older child, some of the big differences between life in California and life in China. But she also notices some things that are the same and some struggles that both places are going through, like gentrification and big box type stores taking over from little mom and pop businesses, things like that affect her family. So I really enjoyed this book. It turns out it's the 3rd book in a trilogy, which I did not realize, but it didn't really matter. I was able to jump right in. The audio was very well done, and I enjoyed that. And I really liked Mia. This novel has a lot woven into it. There's a lot of depth to it. A lot of issues that Mia and her friends and her family are dealing with. And it's got a wonderfully satisfying ending. So I really enjoyed it. That's Room to Dream by Kelly Yang. Next up, I began my reading for Booktopia. Now this is an annual event held at the Northshire Bookstore in Manchester, Vermont, which is a fabulous bookstore, independent bookstore in a wonderful little town in Vermont. Every year they hold this event, this weekend-long event called Booktopia. Now, of course, it was canceled the last 2 years because of the pandemic. So everybody is really excited to go back this year. A lot of us go back year after year. This will be my 5th time, I think. And I usually go with my mother. So we've made our reservations, and it's always the first weekend in May. Booktopia is different than other kinds of book events. Like, you think book event and you think, oh, an author talk or a book signing, something like that. Booktopia, they choose usually 8 to 10 new release books and their authors, and the whole weekend is built around those books. So the authors and the readers, and usually there's between like 100 and 150 attendees, the authors and the readers just kind of hang out together all weekend. There are author talks scheduled, but typically a lot of people have already read the books. So they're more like book club discussions, interactive with the authors rather than the author just reading an excerpt. There's a big event Friday night with dinner and book trivia, which always gets very lively, and a Yankee book swap. It's just a lot of fun, and it is a way to really get to know and spend time with other readers and some authors. So I will include a link down below in case you want more information. It's the first weekend in May in Vermont. Let me know if you're going to be there, because I will too. So the first book I read for Booktopia, my Booktopia preparation this year, was Country of Origin. You can't really see that. I will include a picture. I read it on my Kindle because it is an advanced reader's copy. This book is due out April 12th, so next week. It's called Country of Origin by Dahlia Azim. And wow, what a start for Booktopia. I absolutely loved this novel. For starters, it's set in a It begins in a time and place that I knew nothing about. And I love going to new places and learning about new pieces of history through my reading. This begins in 1952 in Cairo, Egypt. Now, maybe you know more about Egypt's history than I did, but this happened to be the start of their revolution. They were a British colony, which I did not know. And at the start of this book, the main character is 14-year-old Hala. And Hala, like most upper-class girls of that time, she lives a very protected, sheltered life. The only time she really leaves her house is to go with her parents to visit family or to go to school. And she attends a British school, like a private girls' school. So her father's driver drives her to school, drives her home. Other than that, she was really not out of the house much. So this one day in 1952, she's up on the roof of their house where she goes just to get out a little bit, to be outdoors, to see the world, to get some privacy, just to escape a little bit. And this time when she's up on that roof, she notices fires burning all over Cairo. And this is the beginning of the Egyptian Revolution to gain their independence. Her father's in the military, so for the next few years during the revolution, every Friday night he invites some soldiers that he knows, other people in the military, over to the house. And they have cigars and drinks and, talk. This is a men-only thing. But one night, while Hala's up on the roof, one of the soldiers, a young man named Khalil, also comes up on the roof, and they meet. From then on, they meet on the roof. They begin to get to know each other. They talk. They fall in love. And when Hala's 17, she runs away with Khalil. They run away to New York. He wants to get away from the war and the fighting and the violence. She just wants some freedom and to see some of the world. They move to New York, and he begins going to medical school. And of course, it's not quite what Hala imagined. She's still quite lonely and isolated as an Egyptian immigrant in New York at that time. I want to avoid any spoilers, but they do eventually have a daughter named Amina. And the great thing about this novel is that the voice changes, the perspective changes. You get Hala's voice, you get her narration, you get direct narration from Khalil to see his perspective, and later on in the novel, you get Amina's perspective as well. So there is so much to this novel, and I was just completely immersed in it. There is, of course, the history, which I didn't know. The setting, once they leave Egypt, they do go back to visit their families. It's also like a double coming-of-age novel because you get Hala's perspective and later Amina's as they each move into womanhood and try to find their identity and figure out who they are. There are all sorts of things that this family ends up going through. Again, no spoilers, but all of it is very moving and powerful. The writing is beautiful. I just loved everything about this novel. So that is Country of Origin by Dalia Azim, and it comes out next week on April 12th. And the author will be at Booktopia in May. Back to my middle grade reading in middle grade March. Next, I read a middle grade graphic novel, The Creepy Case Files of Margo Malou, The Tangled Web. So this is book 3 in this series, and I love this series. It's just so imaginative, so creative. You can see on the cover, that is Margo herself. She is a renowned monster mediator. in Echo City. So Charles, that's the other kid on the cover, his family moves to Echo City. His parents buy an old apartment building to restore. So they're living in this old apartment building, and Charles realizes there's a troll living in the basement. And the troll happens to like the same, I'm trying to think of the word they use in the book, battle beans. They're like Beanie Babies, toys that Charles likes. And he keeps creeping up to Charles's room and taking them. So another boy in the building, Kevin, advises Charles to go see Margo, because she is the person you go see, even though she's just a kid, whenever there are conflicts between monsters and humans. So the monsters, for the most part, adult humans are mostly unaware of the monsters. And Margo's trying to keep it that way, to keep them safe. So that's kind of the premise of the whole series. In this one, obviously, the tangled web, we get involved with some giant spiders. The stories are very intricate. The kid characters are wonderful. There's a page showing a bunch of the monsters. Margo is playing some sort of monster card game there. So the monsters respect Margo, even though she's a human child. The monsters are just really creative and fun. That's the troll that lives in Charles's and Kevin's basement. But his name is Marcus. And once you get to know him, he's actually pretty nice. And let me see. There's Margo coming to the rescue with the giant spiders down in the tunnels. So I love this whole series. This third book was a wonderful addition. I should have mentioned earlier, the author and illustrator is Drew Wang, very talented. So I highly recommend, whether you have kids or not, you check out the Creepy Case Files of Margo Malou series. And book 3, The Tangled Web, was excellent. Next up was a book off my shelf that I've been meaning to read for a long time. My husband just gave it to me for Christmas this year, but it's been on my TBR list ever since it was released. The Glass Hotel by Emily St. John Mandel. And that cover is just like mesmerizing. It's so beautiful. And in case you think you recognize the name, Emily St. John Mandel is also the author of Station 11. And I found out quite a few other books that I didn't even know about. So I'll have to go back and read some of her backlist. She has a brand new book that I think was just released this week. I don't recall the title of it. But The Glass Hotel was her next novel after Station 11. And I loved it just as much, maybe even more. It centers around a young woman named Vincent. She has grown up in a very remote area on the northern tip of Vancouver Island. Her town, if you can even call it a town, is very isolated and tiny. She lived there with her parents. She has a half-brother named Paul who lives with his mom in Vancouver. No, I think they live in Toronto at the beginning. So anyway, at the beginning of the book, Vincent's mother dies. She takes a canoe out one day and never comes back. So with her disappearance, Vincent's life changes dramatically. Her dad's job often takes him away from home. I think she's 14 when her mother disappears. So she goes to live with an aunt in Vancouver. And the book just follows Vincent's life. So she leaves this very remote area. She moves to Vancouver. She ends up, when she's about 17, I think, living with a friend in this, really shoddy little apartment in the city. Later, she actually moves back to the little town, which is called Cayette, because this crazy billionaire investor has built a luxury hotel on this very remote spot. And, that's what's supposed to be pictured on the front there. the tip of the island that's so remote. So Vincent moves back to her hometown, but this time to work at this luxury hotel. She gets a job as a bartender. And there she meets the owner, builder, the guy who built the whole thing, a man named Jonathan. And she ends up going to live with them. Kind of a sham marriage. They're not really married, but everyone thinks they are. And I don't want to tell you too much more, but there are other scenes in New York City and their luxurious home in Connecticut. Later, Vincent ends up living on a container ship for a while, working as a cook. It's just like this whole epic about her life, although there are chapters from other people's perspectives as well. Paul, her half-brother, some from Jonathan himself, and other characters as they come into the story. So you get different perspectives. I have tried really hard to figure out why I loved this book so much, and it's hard to put my finger on. I think Mandel creates these unique, eccentric characters that you really come to care about. Of course, her writing is wonderful. And, she creates these settings that are very original and unique. I loved The Glass Hotel. I loved every moment while I was reading it. It was one of those books that as I was nearing the end, I didn't want it to end. So highly recommend The Glass Hotel by Emily St. John Mandel. Next up was another middle grade audiobook for middle grade March. This one was called Set Me Free by Anne Claire Lazat. And this fit the category in middle grade March has an orphan in the story. So the main character is not the orphan, though. The main character is a girl named Mary. It's set in the early 1800s, and Mary lives on Martha's Vineyard. Mary was born deaf, but there is a huge community of deaf people on Martha's Vineyard, and this is real historical fact. I never knew this. I had never heard this before in my life. So this alone made this a fascinating story. So because of that, even though deafness was not well understood at the time, Mary has grown up in a loving family with a very supportive community where almost everyone knows their own unique form of sign language. So she's grown up in this very supportive environment. Well, she gets a letter from a friend who's working in Boston, and her friend says she's working at this house, and there's a child there, an orphaned child, who is both deaf and mute and is being horribly mistreated. And she writes to Mary asking if Mary can come and be the girl's tutor, teach her how to learn sign language and how to communicate. So Mary does this, which is a huge leap of faith for her. It is, this is a very brave thing for a 14-year-old deaf girl to do at the time. She takes a boat across the water, travels to Boston, gets to this huge mansion. And it turns out things there are presided over by an evil butler. And the family's away traveling, but they've left this 8-year-old girl in the care of the butler, and he's horrible. And she's been terribly mistreated. She's being kept like an animal. In fact, most of the people in the house, don't even believe that. Well, they think that because she can't speak or communicate, she's stupid. So Mary sets about trying to teach this young girl sign language and how to communicate and just to reach her and connect with her. So that's the setup. A lot happens. This book has so much to it. It's definitely historical fiction with a fascinating historical backdrop. Not just the deaf community, but also the Native Americans in the area, both on Martha's Vineyard and on the mainland. But besides the historical background, there is suspense because there are some things going on with this girl that really don't make sense, and Mary wants to save her. It's a coming-of-age story for Mary herself. It was just a wonderful book. I really enjoyed it. It was excellent on audio. And at the end, I was left, with my brain spinning going, I have to look this stuff up. Well, luckily, the author included several author's notes that give you some of the facts about the deaf community on Martha's Vineyard, historically, about American Sign Language, about the Native Americans that lived in the area, who, by the way, are still fighting for their land today, which is just mind-blowing, from the 1600s to today. So the author's notes included fascinating historical information, saved me the trouble of Googling, and I loved the whole book from beginning to end, the fictional story as well as the facts. So that is Set Me Free by Anne Claire Lizotte. Next up was another middle grade book for middle grade March, but this one had a special significance to me. One of the categories was to read a book published before you were born. Now, I was born in 1965, and rather than seek out something that I hadn't read before, I went back to a childhood favorite that I hadn't read since I was a child. So that is Katie John by Mary Calhoun. This was one of my favorite books as a kid. And it's weird because these days I never hear about it. It's out of print. In fact, well, it's not completely out of print. I did find it on Bookshop, but it's not something I've heard anyone else ever mention, but it was one of my favorites as a kid. So that's Katie on the cover. I think what attracted me as a kid is I just fell in love with the main character, Katie John. She and her family have moved from California to a very small rural community in Missouri, a small town on the Mississippi River. You can see in the picture on the cover, her family inherited this big old brick house that used to belong to her great aunt. So they've moved in for the summer to fix up the house and sell it, and then their plan is to move to New York. Her father's a writer, so he's working on his book this summer. Her mom is busy fixing up the house and trying to sell it. And so Katie's kind of left on her own. So at the beginning, of course, she's really not happy to be here. She had to leave all her friends in California, her school, everything she knew behind, the summer camp she was planning to go to. But then she meets a girl down the street named Sue. And of course, they become best friends. So Katie John and Sue have all these adventures during the summer. They discover mysterious things about the old house and investigate the mysteries. They set up a lemonade stand, and of course things always go wrong. It's just a really fun, delightful book. It's probably set in like the late 50s, early 60s. Doesn't really say. But it holds up. So it was my favorite as a kid, and I enjoyed it again. My only issue was not with the book, but with my own memory, because this is not the book that I remembered it was. So I've got this book in my memory that was one of my favorites as a kid, about a girl just like Katie John, whose family moves somewhere that she doesn't know anyone. And she goes exploring in like the meadows around their house, the fields and the trees and everything. And she finds this old, like ruin of a pioneer house out there. And she spends her summer like looking for clues as to the family that had lived there, and particularly the woman, the young wife who had lived there. So if anybody knows what book that is, I would love to hear, because I thought it was this book, and it's not. So that was my only disappointment. I was reading this and thinking, when's she going to find the old house? Yeah. Oh, wrong book. But I still love this book, Katie John by Mary Calhoun. Next up was another book for Booktopia. This one, it was my only nonfiction for the month. It was called 6 Walks in the Footsteps of Henry David Thoreau. And the author is Ben Shattuck, or Shattuck. I don't know how to say that. This is another one that's not quite out yet. I read an advanced reader copy, but it is due out very soon, April 19th. It's memoir, and I loved it. It is about, well, just like the title says, what the author did was, using Thoreau's books and personal journals, he recreated 6 walks that Thoreau had taken. And his own personal life and the challenges he's dealing with are kind of woven through the narrative as he's taking these walks. So we get, you know, bits of what Thoreau wrote and thought about these places. We get what the author is dealing with at the time and how these walks in nature help him. So the walks are mostly in Cape Cod, where the author lives, along the Massachusetts, Rhode Island coast, up, trying to think, I think there is one, up a hill in Massachusetts. He goes up to northern Maine and hikes up to the top of Mount Katahdin. If you're not familiar with that, that is the terminal end of the Appalachian Trail. It's where the Appalachian Trail ends, if you're hiking south to north, which most people do. It is also the highest point on the eastern seaboard. I'm trying to think if that's its claim. I think that's its claim to fame. Anyway, it's a difficult hike. We've been up there to Baxter State Park, where Mount Katahdin is. And finally, he and one of his friends make a canoe trip in even further northern Maine, in the Allagash Wilderness Waterway. So they canoe up there. And in each case, he's following in Thoreau's footsteps, so to speak. And so he writes beautifully about nature, about Thoreau's experiences, about his own experiences. I love the outdoors. I love hiking and canoeing when I'm able to manage those. And I just loved everything about this book. It's very well written. I loved going along on these journeys with the author. So, and I'm really looking forward to meeting him at Booktopia. So that's 6 Walks in the Footsteps of Henry David Thoreau by Ben Shattuck. Finally, I fit in one last middle grade audiobook. That's how I read so many books this last month. I fit in 3 audios, which is much more than usual. My last one was The Graveyard Riddle by Lisa Thompson. And for middle grade March, this fit the category of a contemporary novel. It's set in the present day in England. This is a companion novel to The Goldfish Boy, which was a very well-received, popular book. So I know a lot of people have read that. So it's about the same characters. But in this case, the focus, in the first book, The Goldfish Boy, that nickname was given to a boy named Matthew who suffers from OCD. And one of the girls on his street, who in that book becomes his friend, is Melody. So in this book, The Graveyard Riddle, the focus is all on Melody. Matthew's doing a little better. He's getting therapy for his OCD. He's able to leave his house now and go to school. He still struggles, but, he's dealing with it. Melody, though, this time is the one with some problems to deal with. And there's another boy on their street, Jake, who they go to school with. And Matthew and Jake are becoming really close. So that's difficult for Melody. But also Melody's mom drops a bombshell that's going to change Melody's life. And she's very upset about that. So in the midst of all of this, there's a cemetery near their neighborhood. And one day Melody is walking her dachshund, Frankie, short for Frankfurter, of course, through the cemetery. And she discovers this really old, hundreds-year-old house, covered with vines and choked with weeds, hidden in a corner. And she discovers that it was what was known as a plague house from back in the 1600s, where they would quarantine people during the plague. So she's investigating this house. She's fascinated by it. And then she discovers there's actually someone living in it, a boy about her age named Hal. Now, Hal tells her that he's a spy and they need to solve, if she's willing to help him, they need to solve some riddles to bring down a criminal. So Melody starts to trust him and believe him after a while. The two of them are working together. When she finally tells Matthew and Jake, they're a little more skeptical. And so this is the mystery at the heart of this book. Who is Hal? What's going on with him? As well as the different things that the kids are dealing with. Jake is being bullied. Melody's got a lot to deal with. So it all comes together very nicely. The audiobook was excellent, very well done, and I enjoyed it. So that's The Graveyard Riddle by Lisa Thompson. And that was it for my March. It was an excellent reading month in March. Ooh, if I had to choose favorite, it is a tie, I think, between The Glass Hotel and Country of Origin. Both of those books just completely sucked me in and grabbed me, and I never wanted them to end. And I would love to hear what you read last month. Let me know in the comments down below what your favorite book was last month.